Look, somewhere in your history, there is a version of you that lasted about 6 weeks. New gym schedule, new diet, maybe a new way of speaking to the people you love, calmer, more patient. The person you actually intended to be. It worked. You could feel it working. Other people noticed. Then, without a single dramatic decision to quit, it didn't. That collapse gets filed under willpower almost every time. Not enough discipline, not enough motivation. It shouldn't be filed there because there is a specific psychological mechanism that predicts when that collapse happens, why it tends to arrive right around the point the change becomes undeniable and visible to other people, and why the part of you doing the sabotaging isn't the lazy part of you at all. It's the part trying to keep you consistent. 2 different layers. Start with what most transformation content actually targets, because it's almost always the same layer. And that layer was never the real problem. Call it the behavioral layer. What you do, what time you get up, what you eat, how you respond when someone criticizes you at work, how many times a week you show up to the gym. It's visible, it's trackable, it's the layer every habit app, every 30-day challenge, every New Year's framework is built to modify. For the simple reason that it's the only layer that fits neatly on a spreadsheet. Underneath it, quieter and much harder to instrument, sits the identity layer. Not what you do, but who you take yourself to be while you're doing it. Somebody trying to exercise, or somebody who exercises, somebody attempting to be patient with their children, or a patient parent. These sound like the same fact, worded 2 different ways. They aren't. So, they're descriptions of 2 different systems operating on 2 different timescales, and under pressure, only one of them tends to survive. Behavior stacked on top of an unchanged identity is held up almost entirely by willpower, a resource that isn't fixed, that fluctuates with sleep, stress, grief, a demanding week, a bad diagnosis, a breakup. Behavior aligned with identity doesn't require that constant, exhausting top-up, because the system isn't spending energy fighting itself just to maintain a status quo it's already decided to enforce. This is the reason the same person can succeed at a given habit for 6 weeks and then fail at the identical habit using the identical method repeatedly across years. The habit was never the unstable variable. What sat beneath it, unexamined, was the mechanism that defends the old self. We still haven't explained why the collapse happens on something close to a schedule, why it tends to land right around the point the new version of you starts becoming real instead of aspirational, rather than at some random moment. This is where that gets answered. Psychologist William Swann's self-verification theory found something that runs against the assumption most people carry about how the self operates. The assumption that we're motivated above all to see ourselves positively, and that we'll gravitate toward whatever feedback makes us feel best about who we are. Swann's research found the self-concept is optimizing for something else first, and that something is consistency, not positivity. In his studies, people holding negative self-views sometimes preferred feedback in relationships that confirmed those negative views over feedback that was more flattering but inconsistent with what they already believed about themselves. Accuracy of self-image inside this framework outranks the pleasantness of it. The system would rather be confirmed than complimented. Apply that mechanism directly to transformation, and the collapse stops looking mysterious, stops looking like a character flaw, and starts looking like a predictable output of a specific input. If the running self-concept underneath everything is, I'm someone who doesn't follow through, then new behavior that contradicts it, even objectively good behavior, even behavior producing visible results, generates friction. Not because some hidden part of you secretly wants to fail, because a system built to preserve consistency has just detected a mismatch between the story it's been maintaining and the evidence now accumulating against it. And it resolves the mismatch the cheap way. It pulls the evidence back into line with the existing story, rather than doing the much harder work of rewriting the story to match the new evidence. This connects to something psychologist James Marcia's research on identity status established in a related but distinct context, originally studying adolescent development. Marcia's framework treats identity not as a fixed trait a person simply has once and for all, but as something closer to a standing, achieved through active exploration and commitment. capable of being revisited and reworked well past adolescence, where his original research was centered. Reworking it, though, requires engaging that layer directly and deliberately. It does not happen automatically as a side effect of doing more push-ups, however many weeks in a row you manage it. There's a related idea worth naming carefully without dressing it up as more directly relevant than it is. The broader concept of a psychological set point, most rigorously documented in the context of well-being rather than identity specifically, comes from Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell's work on hedonic adaptation, later extended by other researchers studying subjective well-being over time. Their findings showed that people tend to return to a relatively stable baseline level of satisfaction, even after major positive or negative life events, lottery wins included. That research was conducted on well-being, not on identity or habit persistence, so it isn't direct evidence for identity-level relapse. But it describes a closely related structural tendency. Systems built around a baseline tend to pull deviations back toward that baseline, whether the deviation is good or bad. Self-verification theory describes that same pulling force operating specifically on self-concept, addition versus substitution. The fix isn't more behavior stacked onto the same unexamined foundation. Most transformation attempts, without anyone quite deciding it this way, are structured as addition. Bolt a new habit onto an identity that hasn't moved an inch. It sits there like a coat draped over frame that hasn't changed shape. It can be taken off the moment conditions turn cold, because nothing underneath it was ever restructured. The alternative is substitution, at the level of the story being run about who you are. Writer James Clear's popular framing of identity-based habits gestures toward exactly this, though it's worth being precise about what kind of source that is. Clear's work is a synthesis and popularization, not an empirical study, and the mechanism underneath his framing is the one already described here. I'm trying to exercise is a goal statement, evaluated against outcomes, and outcomes are inherently inconsistent. So the goal remains perpetually at risk of feeling unmet, no matter how much progress has actually occurred. I'm someone who exercises is an identity claim instead, evaluated by the same consistency-seeking system Swan's research describes. Once enough repeated evidence accumulates behind that claim, the very mechanism that used to sabotage new behavior flips and starts defending it instead, because now it's the old behavior, the skipped session, the abandoned morning, that reads as the inconsistency requiring correction. Psychologist Dan McAdams's work on narrative identity supplies the deeper reason this distinction runs beyond phrasing into mechanism. His research describes human beings as organizing the self not as a running list of isolated actions, but as a story, with a protagonist, a through line, and an implied trajectory. A single gym visit is a data point, easily forgotten, easily dismissed as an exception. A story in which you have been consistently, across time, someone who trains is an identity, and identities are what the self-verification system is built to defend. Substitution means changing which story the behavior is filed under. Addition just appends another entry to a list the old narrator is still quietly writing, in the same handwriting, under the same title. There's a related tension worth mentioning too. Psychologist Tori Higgins' self-discrepancy theory describes the strain that arises specifically from the gap between someone's actual self and their ideal self, the version they're working toward. Higgins' research associated larger gaps with specific emotional consequences, including dejection-related states when the ideal feels persistently out of reach. That gap is precisely where most transformation attempts stall, not because the ideal was wrong, but because the actual self, the one Swan's mechanism keeps defending, hasn't been given a structured way to close the distance without triggering the resistance already described. The gap most people quit inside. None of this happens instantly, and this is the part that explains why people who understand the theory, who could recite this entire argument back to you, still fail to apply it under real conditions. There is a stretch of time, sometimes weeks, often months. The new behavior is happening reliably, showing up on the calendar, producing visible results, and the identity still hasn't caught up. You've trained 4 times a week for 2 months. It still doesn't feel true internally to say, I'm an athletic person. It feels like a claim the rest of you hasn't signed off on, like wearing a name tag that belongs to someone slightly more capable than you currently believe yourself to be. Psychologist James Prochaska's trans-theoretical model of behavior change includes a stage almost no self-improvement content engages with honestly. Relapse, treated not as a failure occurring outside the model, but as an expected, structurally built-in phase within the change process itself. Prochaska's research found this happening to most people attempting significant change, often more than once, before anything holds permanently. That reframing matters enormously for the gap being described here, because the discomfort inside it gets almost universally misread by the person experiencing it. People take the fact that the new identity doesn't feel true yet as proof the change isn't real, isn't sticking, isn't actually them. It's usually the opposite signal. It's Swann's consistency mechanism generating exactly the friction his research predicts, pushing back against a story that hasn't yet accumulated enough repetition to feel stable. That friction is expected whether inside a known process. It is not a verdict on whether the process is working, and treating it as one is precisely what causes most attempts to end right before they would have consolidated. The people who make it through this stretch aren't the ones who feel more certain while they're inside it. They're the ones who keep acting from the new identity while it still feels borrowed, slightly ill-fitting, not yet theirs, rather than treating that specific discomfort as evidence to stop. Closing. So the question worth asking was never, why can't I stick to anything? That question keeps the search pinned entirely to the behavioral layer, hunting for a stricter schedule, a better app, a more motivating quote taped to a mirror. The better question is what this behavior is actually attached to underneath. A costume can be put on for 6 weeks and taken off the moment things get hard because it was never structural. It was only ever draped over whoever happened to be standing there before you started. A foundation gets poured once, holds weight it doesn't feel yet, sits there unglamorously in the dark for longer than feels reasonable, and only starts to feel solid after something has actually been built on top of it. Repeatedly, through weather that wanted it to crack. You were never as inconsistent as the collapse made you look. You were just asking a coat to do a foundation's job and wondering, every single time it came off in the cold, what was wrong with you for not being able to keep it on.